College football nerds here to talk Alabama, LSU, and review what we saw Saturday. It was a fun game, ton of action, did not disappoint, maybe disappointed a little bit if you're an Alabama fan. We're going to get into that right now. And Josh, I got to say, at halftime, it looked like that it was going to be Clemson, Alabama all over again. I really felt like that's how Alabama was playing. They turned it on in the second half. We saw a lot of the mental mistakes that I flagged in our preview. I said Alabama, when they play somebody who punches them in the mouth early and shows they can go step for step with them, they panic, they freak out, and then you see a lot of mental errors. And it's something that's in the DNA of this team now. I think they're used to just being able to bully everybody, and when they can't, they freak out. And you can't say it didn't show up with Tua fumbling the ball with nobody around him, punters fumbling, all these weird penalties that the other team's not doing. I think they panicked a little bit. But before we get into any of that, for my eyes, at the end of the game, when it was all said and done, my assessment of these two teams, besides the fact that I think they're two of the four best teams in the country, my assessment of these two teams was, and see if everybody can follow along, Alabama has a better offense collectively, not just quarterback. Collectively, Alabama has a better offense than LSU. LSU has a better defense than Alabama, and LSU's gap defensively over Alabama is wider than Alabama's gap is offensively over LSU. Tell me what you think about that.
I don't really disagree with it. I mean, Burrow had a better day than Tua. Now, I will say it's hard to guess how much that injury hurt Tua. And I do think early in the game it hurt him really almost more. It seemed like he was rusty and missing things and was a little slower than normal. And then he got hot, obviously, later. And you could see at the end of the game that these were two awesome quarterbacks dueling at it. But outside that, I think Alabama's receivers are a little bit better. I do think Edwards-Helaire is a good back. Najee Harris showed perhaps that he's a better back. They're both very, very good, but I think maybe the edge somewhat goes to Alabama. The difference is that defensively, for all their quirks and how they struggled a little bit in the run defense, LSU was a more solid all-around unit. Their corners played very well. They were aggressive. More importantly, they tackled and moved to the ball well, and it's just defensively in general, LSU was always swarming to the ball, and Alabama almost never was. It seemed like everywhere LSU went to the ball, especially when they went wide, an Alabama defender would over pursue, would be out of position, whereas LSU almost never was, and they would get some yards, give up some yards, but they'd be in place. Most of Alabama's yardage seemed to be more hard fought. For that reason, I do agree with you. I think the gap in this game was more about LSU's defense being better. It's interesting because advanced stats had Alabama better, but I think, a lot of people talked about, well, it was just garbage time. We were included in that. We weren't quite sure what to do with it. But we've also said a lot that sometimes garbage time does tell you more than you think it does. And a lot of the issues we saw from Alabama defensively in garbage time, quote unquote, in terms of giving up cheap and easy points and missing assignments, those showed their ugly head. And they had to rotate throughout this game. And when they were rotating and they had backups in, they just weren't effective. And I think Alabama's depth really showed. And I will say they didn't really play the starters all at once, almost any point in the game. Watching them in this game, Alabama rotated throughout, and that lack of depth really hurt them, whereas LSU, I think, was a lot better off.
Yeah, and Alabama rotated throughout, not because their guys were tired. It was because they couldn't find an answer, especially at linebacker. They were playing Benton 36, who gave up the really big bust at the end of the first half to Clyde Edwards-Helaire on the touchdown. He was completely lost, and he was in there because Shane Lee is not a great guy in space covering a running back out of the backfield. So that for me, and I don't want people to take away from that I think that, Alabama's, when I say Alabama's better offensively, it is at what you touched on. I think that collectively, look, they've got probably 4 first-round quality wide receivers. They've got 2 first-round tackles, an NFL caliber running back. I think LSU's offense is elite as well as Alabama's. And I do think, like, if I'm drafting a quarterback right now, I'm taking Burrow over Tua. And I'm taking I'm giving Burrow the Heisman. Part of it is that, Tua did make those mistakes early, and I think they were calling the game around his ankle a little bit early. But look, Burrow didn't make those mistakes. And if nothing else, Burrow hasn't been hurt for 2 years, so durability is a factor as well. So it was interesting to see Alabama come back late, and you made a point about how Alabama's defense didn't seem to be swarming to the ball. One of the things I want to give LSU credit for is Alabama scored the most hard-fought 41 points I think I've ever seen. I mean, they were making incredible plays, but LSU, except for, Stingley had some busts, and this is what we said. You said this and got a little bit killed. Lamar, I think we were proven right in this respect. You said Fulton is an elite corner, and Stingley one day will be a first-rounder, but he's not Fulton yet. And he may have got a little distracted on the 60-something yarder, but he got just worked a couple of times by Smith, and especially on the 88-yarder. But for me, Fulton is easily the first corner coming off the board. I think he is more valuable to that team than Delpit, and especially because of how the game works now in terms of passing. He's a far less liability in pass coverage, and he helps out in the run game as well. Tell me, for you, your biggest positive overall that you took from this game for LSU, because if you say Alabama's defense was struggling, they're going to struggle against other teams. Tell me something in general that LSU did that had no bearing on Alabama, messing around themselves, mental mistakes here or there. Give me your biggest positive for LSU coming out of this game.
LSU was aggressive defensively with Aranda, and they were able to generate a pass rush. They had a lot of guys involved. And I said going into this game, it was baffling to me that the defense hadn't been better than it was. That they're ridiculously talented and for some reason hadn't quite put it all together. Aranda got 2 notches more aggressive in this game than I'd really seen him, which was interesting. That maybe he had a better game plan. Maybe it was the extra preparation. But Stevens and Queen and Chason were all over the field, but they've got a ton of guys that can generate pressure, should have been able to all year, and they were able to finally start doing that. And Tua was almost never comfortable in the pocket. And they got a lot of guys that not only could they get pressure, but unlike Alabama, they could actually run him down and bring him to the ground if they needed to. Alabama struggled to do that. And I will say Chason didn't really wow me as a pass rusher. He did pretty well. But the biggest thing he did was he was able to play. I think they got smart with him, maybe self-scouted and realized he wasn't, probably due to his power, he wasn't doing a great job on the edge. But what they were able to do is to take him and start dropping him into zone and do some things with him more as a straight linebacker. And they were extremely effective with Chason about blowing up screen plays, quick throws to the running backs and receivers or tight ends. He took out a lot of Alabama's horizontal passing game that had been so effective, and it was the other guys too, right? It was Queen and it was Stevens, and it was all that speed and athleticism. They played kind of in the box and they played down and they played very effectively. I hadn't really seen that great from LSU. I don't know if it was something was held back. I think some of it was self-scouting and adjusting how their scheme worked, but it was definitely something I saw as a positive.
On the flip side, the positive for me, I thought Alabama also did pretty well with the pass rush. They didn't finish as many times as they needed to, but I thought that was more Burrow than anything else. I mean, I think Joe Burrow had a game. He was playing out of his mind, even elevated higher than I've used to, and I've already been high on him. I'm used to seeing. The concern I have from Alabama, if I'm talking about one or thinking about one, is we saw this Alabama secondary as a huge strength, and you did flag, or I think I did, in your top 5 reasons why LSU might not win. Shaheem Carter was a liability, and he was not as much of a liability in this game, although Maiden, the safety, was a huge liability. The one concern I have, if I'm Alabama and I'm saying, okay, let's say Alabama makes the playoffs, and they've got to play in LSU or an Ohio State again, or even a Clemson. Trevon Diggs really scared me in this game, and he was something that we saw for Alabama as a strength. And in this game, he was borderline liability. He was decent in coverage. He really got burned on the first touchdown. But the lack of physicality, and there were a couple of really important plays down the stretch in the fourth quarter where he had a guy on the boundary that he just had to keep from getting a first down. And instead of like getting physical and bumping him out of bounds or making a good strong tackle, he allowed them to get 5-6 yards, dragging him down the field. And so for me, I think he lost a lot of money in this game, and also sort of exposed where we already knew the linebackers were a little bit of a liability, and now it's like you got Patrick Surtain and McKinney, and then you've got maybe some other liabilities on the other side. Did you see something similar?
I did. I think everybody watching that game did. Now, I do think it's always a little harsh when you're criticizing a corner because he's getting pushed around by, a running back or a tight end. I think LSU's receivers are kind of a mismatch for everybody. They're huge. I mean, they're big, extremely athletic, extremely physical, probably the most physically imposing receiving core out there outside of Clemson's. I don't know that they're as explosive as Alabama's, but what you saw them do was catch the ball underneath and get, yards after catch physically, where Alabama's receivers can't really run over guys like that. But I do agree with you. And I mean, they're in a difficult position. And a lot of those plays were because the linebackers weren't ever really giving them help. They weren't ever flowing. I will say this, from the beginning of the season, when we talked a little bit about Alabama and LSU, and maybe even we started with our top 10s, everybody was scared with the linebackers. And I know going into the Duke game, I think we did a preview of that game, but I know we talked about it. We both felt like when Moses went out that it was probably going to cost Alabama a title. And there was no doubt in my mind, watching this game, it's always impossible to know how the flow changes, but just watching it in real time, I did feel like Alabama wins this game with Dylan Moses, and without him, they struggled. I mean, the difference is just so dramatic because they're getting nothing from the linebacker position that it puts so much of a strain on the corners, because now all of a sudden they're responsible for shutting the edge because the linebackers just, they're not even there. And that's really that's not like an excuse for Alabama because it's somebody that's been out all season and it's going to be the reality for them the rest of the season. It's just reality. But that was the big difference in this game to me, was how the LSU linebackers were constantly flowing to the ball on the perimeter, whereas every time that LSU got the ball to the perimeter, it felt like there was some corner one-on-one trying to do the best job he could. I know there was one play where Benton tried to tackle Edwards-Helaire, and he had him dead to rights about 1 or 2 yards past the line of scrimmage, and he just got, flew clean off his feet, whiffed him, and Edwards-Helaire went for about 12 yards.
Yeah, and there's really a recent data point that's similar to this, where 2017 Alabama's linebacking core in the middle of the season got ravaged, and they were playing like walk-ons and third stringers and fourth stringers in the Mississippi State and Auburn games, and it showed. And they couldn't tackle Mississippi State. They couldn't tackle Kerryon Johnson. Almost lost to Mississippi State, lost to Auburn and decisively, got those linebackers back for the end of the year and won the national championship. And the difference is you've got the same or worse linebacking situation at Alabama right now, and you're not getting them back. The flip side, you have a far better offense, but what you're looking at in a situation like this, and tell me if you think this is right, because they're such a liability, and because this is what you've got for the rest of the year, Alabama theoretically could still win a national championship, but it's going to have to be a 46-41 type game against an Ohio State, against an LSU. It's not going to be a 27-20 type game that they're going to win against these elite teams.
I would agree with that, and this is the difficulty when you have a weakness on defense. I think one of the more underrated points in this game, Alabama in their first 7 possessions, offensively, scored 7 points. 1 of 7. Now, they had 13 points going into the half, but of course one of them was a punt return. The offense was almost totally ineffective. Now, a lot of that, you can talk about rust, you can talk about a lot of different things. We've talked about this a lot on the show. Offenses have cold spurts. Basically, Alabama had a repeat of what happened with Oklahoma and Kansas State. It's a lot more forgivable because to do it against LSU is a lot easier to do than to do it against Kansas State. LSU is a tremendously better team. But they just went cold, and they were moving the ball fairly well early in the game, but they were not hitting conversions. They missed on a couple fourth downs. They had a couple turnovers. And that's all it takes to lose when you have this kind of a deficiency on defense, because you're going to give up 40 points to a really, really good team. And you can't afford to have go 1 of 7 on offensive possession, scoring on 1 of 7 offensive possessions in the first half, getting effectively 56 possible points for both teams, eight possessions total. LSU scored 33 of 56. Alabama scored 13 of 56, and their fate was sealed by halftime. You just can't afford any offensive letdowns, and offensive letdowns always happen to every team. And that's why super high-powered offenses usually drop some inexplicable game if they're not defensively focused. So I do think it's a reality. I felt early in the season that Alabama was continuing to prove, largely because the freshman linebackers played fairly well early in the year, had their bumps, and looked to be getting better. I personally, having watched that game, I don't know how the freshmen would have done starting at middle linebacker, but it's clear Alabama made this decision that they were going to play a more experienced guy in Benton, probably because he could play assignments, and it didn't work. And now maybe it's easy to say it didn't work. It's harder to say if something else would have worked better, but their one hope was that those freshman linebackers would come on and be really good players, and at the end of the season they'd be really good. And it's kind of funny, ironic, or maybe a strategic flaw in their thinking that they instead decided to roll the dice with a more experienced linebacker in terms of seniority with the team. But Benton has not played much for Alabama either in past years, and hadn't played much this year, I believe, due to injury. And so they actually played a guy that was really less experienced even than the freshman, I guess thinking he knew the scheme, and he just wasn't good. And I almost wonder if they would have been better off playing a freshman and letting him have some mistakes a couple drives, and then maybe he makes a couple of those big plays. I don't know. But they just never developed the linebacker depth that we thought maybe they would. And like you said, there's no magic thing that's going to solve, no magic pill that's going to solve it. I mean, their guys are out with ACLs. So this is what they got going into playoffs, and they got to figure out something desperately fast. Even if they were to make the playoffs, to be able to stand a chance of winning it. And, obviously that's a long shot at this point.
All right. So I want to skip ahead, do a little hypothetical comparison. And let's put LSU in the playoffs. And let's say they're playing either Ohio State or Clemson. Tell me some things that you saw in this game, because you've watched so much. We've watched a ton of Ohio State and Clemson this year. Not as much Clemson because they haven't played a lot of great teams, but we watched a lot of their games. We've watched basically every Ohio State game a good bit. Tell me what you saw in this game that you feel would be a good advantage for LSU, or potentially over either one of those teams in a game with either one of those teams.
I think the biggest advantage, I'll give you an advantage for both teams. So I think the biggest advantage LSU would have over Ohio State is that LSU, particularly on defense, their corners are very good, and they have very athletic players at linebacker and safety. And I've said this before, Ohio State is really feasting on teams by splitting them way wide, because Justin Fields, and we really don't know how good Justin Fields is. We truly don't at this point, because of how dominant they've been and the competition level they played. Really, competition level, even if they've been good teams, they haven't been very athletic teams. But they spread them really wide, and Fields can make these throws way out to the boundary because of his arm strength, and just to get the ball out there on time. And with teams spread that wide, they cannot deal with the run game because the corners and safeties are split way out wide. And now they can't react fast enough to deal with Dobbins when there's a big hole in the middle. LSU is way more athletic, and they're going to be able to react better on those plays. They can put guys on an island a lot more comfortably and deal with Ohio State's receivers, which means the safeties and linebackers, however they want to mix them in, can be closer to the line of scrimmage, or at least closer to the center of the field. And the guys they have can actually match up one-on-one much better athletic with Ohio State in the middle of the field. That's a big advantage for LSU. I do think really the biggest problem for LSU would be Ohio State, even without Chase Young, They have a great pass rush. They're very athletic. They have great corners. Defensively, they're just hard to score on. And they got a lot of hay against Alabama, basically by just flipping the ball around, finding somebody out of position, and exploiting the linebackers. Ohio State's a lot better, and they've gotten a lot better than they were last year. The defensive front's a lot more active. It's a lot more like what they faced against Auburn, but with better athletes. It's really an Auburn plus defense. And we already saw Auburn give LSU a lot of fits, particularly in the red zone. I think Ohio State would do the same thing, only worse, that Auburn did to LSU. So I think you'd end up with a much more low-scoring game between the two teams, if I had to guess. And it's really the result of both teams' defenses matching up better, I think, than really any defense LSU's faced or any defense Ohio State's faced, maybe by some margin.
Yeah, one of the things when I'm thinking about, it's easy to kill Clemson because they haven't played anybody, and we can say we don't know how they'd be, but we don't and we do because we know their defense is elite, and we have some thoughts that they're sandbagging a little bit and their offense might be great. For me, Ohio State has yet to play anybody that has discovered the forward pass. They did have Indiana, but Indiana was playing their backup quarterback, so that's a little bit of a struggle for me. We've seen this week alone just how bad Michigan State is and how bad their defense is this year. Their defense has fallen off tremendously. Wisconsin is not as bad of a team as they're getting credit for right now because the Illinois lost, because Illinois is clearly not that bad of a team. But Wisconsin's offense is Stone Age, old SEC style offense. Do you have concerns if LSU, we still got Ohio State number one, just to put that out there. Do you have some concerns that Ohio State is a little bit like what we saw with Minnesota Penn State, where Penn State hadn't seen an offense at all year that was any good? Ohio State hasn't seen anybody that can throw the ball and could potentially be in real trouble in a game against LSU.
I do. And I think it's a little bit what happened to Alabama. I mean, the biggest thing that Alabama struggled with was, one, the efficiency of Burrow, which Burrow is far more effective as a passer than anyone Ohio State's played. And Penn State's biggest problem was that Minnesota had an actual live quarterback that could actually throw down the field. And it exposed a lot of things that just hadn't shown up because the Big Ten is truly deficient at quarterback right now. There are only a couple good quarterbacks, and they kind of stick out like a sore thumb. I mean, heck, you can see the difference Penix made when he's played versus when he's been out. But I think the other thing that concerns me is that the past couple years, Ohio State has really struggled with physicality in opposing receivers. Their corners have gotten pushed around a lot, and they've struggled to tackle. And they haven't played teams that have any sort of a combination of good physical receivers and a good passing game from the quarterback position. LSU's able to throw the ball out to really good athletes that are big and physical on the perimeter. They're able to get complete short passes effectively and efficiently and give guys a chance to turn upfield. I don't know if Ohio State has solved their problems in terms of getting pushed around, missing tackles, getting run over, getting blocked out on space and giving up big perimeter plays. I mean, that was what destroyed them last year with all these lots of horizontal plays that would turn upfield where Ohio State just basically got pushed around in the secondary by receivers or couldn't make tackles. It's possible that LSU could do the same thing.
All right, y'all, that's our kind of review of this game. Let us know in the comments what you think your biggest takeaway was from this game and whether or not you think Alabama, based on playing LSU this close, deserves a shot at the playoffs. Also, we did 5 reasons why Alabama would win this game, 5 reasons why LSU would win this game, and we're going to revisit those in another video this week and see how many we got right, how many we got wrong. So make sure you check those out. Might post a little bit after this video, so keep an eye out for it. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.